Hey there. Sorry, I thought there would be a countdown. I'm Haley Mirr. I am the Director of Operations here at Mirr Ranch Group. Welcome again to our Lay of the Land live stream, where every other week we discuss the ranch and sporting property market, buying and selling advice, and the latest best stewardship practices, as well as topics currently impacting landowners. Mirr Ranch Group is a full-service ranch real estate brokerage and consulting company focusing on legacy ranches, sporting and conservation properties around the West. Today, we're going to be talking about fly fishing properties, including the current market for this type of property, issues private landowners are facing across the West when it comes to stream access, as well as other topics impacting owners and buyers of fly fishing properties. Thank you to everyone, as always, for submitting your questions. We'll try to get to them as many as we can on this broadcast, but if we don't, we will get back to you after this with some more detailed answers. Let's see, and helping me out today is the founder of Mirr Ranch Group, Ken Mirr. Welcome, Ken. Hey there. Let's see. I think he's having a little noise stuff. But hi, Ken. Good to see you. Once we figure that out, everything will be fine. But Ken isn't necessarily the fly fishing guru. We have Daniel Carter, who's going to be joining us as well. So Daniel Carter is a former fly fishing guide and Montana native. Daniel has been brokering fly fishing properties and ranches for the past decade with us. And he's probably the best person to kind of have on this podcast and live stream, Daniel Carter. Perfect. Hey there, Daniel. How are you?
I'm well. You can hear me.
I can
hear me now.
I can hear you now.
I can hear you now.
I wonder what that button was for.
That's the mute button.
It was blinking at me.
Awesome. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for joining us today and for giving us your sage kind of advice about fly fishing properties, giving us a little bit of knowledge. And we're excited to have you here.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to be here and always happy to talk fly fishing.
Awesome. Perfect. So I guess we're going to kind of go right into it. So Daniel actually wrote an article that we will be putting out later this week. If you want to learn more about this topic we're going over today, if you subscribe to our newsletter, you'll be able to see it. But one of the big things we talk about in that article is stream access issues. A lot of people, there's stream access, wade versus float. There's a lot of different issues and every state is different. So I guess we'll kind of start with Colorado, since that's where the majority of a lot of our fly fishing properties are located, and go beyond there.
Yeah. I think, just to start, I think this is a meaty discussion, right? You can go down the rabbit hole pretty quickly on any of these stream access law type of issues from state to state. But, it's one of the first conversations that we have with prospective buyers and aspiring owners of fly fishing properties. It's one of the foundational things that drives value on fly fishing ranches throughout the West. And so it's one of the fundamental things that a buyer needs to understand when approaching potentially owning a fly fishing ranch. And it drives, the main thing is location. Where do you want to be? What type of stream access law are you comfortable with? It's definitely an education in getting familiar with that, and it's something that we try to bring to our buyers' attention from the get-go. That's step one. So I think trying to provide a broad overview is kind of the place to start, and basically every state there's different nuances to stream access law, but starting with Colorado, we do a lot, obviously, in Colorado. That's where we're based. And all of this kind of goes back to whatever state you're in, this all goes back to when states became states, what we call statehood, and those laws. And as state constitutions got written, a lot of the law today is derived from that time in history. So in Colorado, the stream bed, which means the land that the river or stream or creek is flowing over, the stream bed can be privately owned. So if you own a ranch, you can actually own the bed of the stream. The water in Colorado, whether that be a creek or a river or a lake, that water is considered to be a public asset. So it's owned essentially by the state of Colorado for the beneficial use of the citizens of the state. But let's put this into practical matter. If you're a wade fisherman, you need to be wading on the river, right? So you need to be touching and walking on the stream bed. If you do not have permission from the private landowner that surrounds that fishery to be walking in the stream, then you would be trespassing. Taking that to a different state, per se, like Montana, it's a very different approach. So in Montana, you kind of see the opposite. So the stream bed, as well as the water flowing through the stream, both are considered to be a publicly owned asset in the state of Montana. So as long as you're accessing the stream from a legal public access point, and you're not trespassing, walking across a private ranch to access the stream, let's say you're getting it at a public bridge or even a public access point that's owned by the state, or it might be on BLM land. As long as you're accessing the stream from that a public access point, then you can stay within the watermark, what we call the ordinary high water mark, which is, again, one of those kind of complex things to understand when we talk about stream access law. But, in the springtime, most rivers swell and we have runoff. So the water is higher, and later in the summer and the fall, the water comes down. But there is a historic high water mark that you can see where the water historically has been high. And as long as a person is within that ordinary high water mark, and they don't come up outside of that, then they can stay within the stream and they are not trespassing, and they can access as much as they want. They can walk up the stream, down the stream. So, we can go into each state if you want, but that kind of is a good compare and contrast of how we look at stream access law across states, and that, that access can certainly drive valuation on private fishing ranches.
Yeah, Haley, and Daniel, going back, when I moved out in '83 and started to law school, you kind of learn these things, but the people who really know a lot about these access issues are the fishing guides and the public fishermen. So they tend to know when they're going in on properties or where they regularly go. But we do find a lot of landowners that are looking at properties sometimes don't know these nuances of these laws, and they're sometimes surprised. They get surprised, and there's one thing about wading and there's another thing about floating. They're all kind of, these are all issues that impact the properties, and they're all considered, stream access. Be you floating, are you anchoring? There's all these nuances that you can enter too. What, can you slow down? Can you row back and stay in an eddy for a while? Can you slowly drift and with an anchor kind of moving? And like anything in any situation too, some people really can be supportive and acknowledge it, and then there's others that of course can abuse those situations. And it is, we hear all the stories, as we represent landowners. Sure.
And I could see where that high water mark could be a little arbitrary, and some people don't quite understand it. So kind of having that knowledge base and talking to fly fishing guides and brokers and really understanding what that means. Because I know I've been floating before where we didn't really know where we could anchor, where the line was, things like that. So having that before you.
Yeah. And there are two different perspectives of this, right? Like, you've kind of got the perspective of the private landowner and private property rights. And then you have the perspective of, the public recreationist, whether that's a whitewater rafter or fly fisherman or a kayaker or whatever, whoever's using that water. And, sometimes what's good for one isn't good for the other. But these stream access laws allow there to be, a common kind of understanding amongst the user groups of water so that we can navigate these things effectively. I mean, the floating thing is a great thing to talk about, right? Because wade fishing is one thing and floating out of a drift boat or a raft is entirely another.
Right.
And these things have nuances from state to state also. Like, for instance, like in Utah, their law specifically states that you can incidentally touch the bottom of stream. So if you happen to be going through a shallow stretch where your raft skids on the bottom of a riffle, that's okay. It's understood and actually prescribed in the law that that's something that's permissible through their stream access. Same thing when it comes to a dangerous obstruction in the river. Let's say there's what we call a strainer, would be like a big log has fallen across the stream and you're floating, you come around the corner, you can portage that obstruction. And what portage means is essentially get your boat out of the water and walk it on the land around that, get back in the stream and keep going. So Utah has actually recently kind of updated that because that's a little bit more modern use, right? Like back when Utah became a state, that wasn't really something that was concerning for stream access. I mean, back then it was a lot of commercial, use and commerce of how we utilized streams, from floating logs down the river to, for timber harvester, or a commercial trapper that's going, up in a canoe to try to collect, beaver pelts and furs and so forth. But so that's evolved a little bit in a state like Utah. You take Wyoming, for instance, and if you drop your anchor in a stream in Wyoming, you are considered to be trespassing and you can be written a ticket for it. Even if, like in Colorado, if you're floating and, both sides of the stream and the stream bed are owned by a private landowner and your raft skids the bottom of the river, you're considered to be trespassing. So I think it's the responsibility of these water users and different user groups to understand what the law is, where they are. And I think it's also important for landowners to understand and interpret accurately the lay of the land where they are, because there can be a lot of confusion and conflict that comes from that.
Hey, Daniel,
Sure.
I was curious too, with all your years, even with guiding, have you ever come across a situation too where a landowner may have intentionally set up somewhat of a blockade where you have to get out of your boat and go around?
Yeah.
Have you seen that?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great kind of follow up of like, the landowner understanding the law. I had it in Montana, right? When even no trespassing signs, right? Staked on the river. No, this is now private land from here on upstream. And so, yes, I mean, that's a common thing that fishermen and river users have to navigate. And I think, the best thing to do, instead of trying to, incite a personal conflict, is to, probably contact your local fishing game and let them deal with it, whether it's a, foul actor, recreational boater, or a landowner that has improperly interpreted the law where they are.
The funny thing is, all the years I've done, and I'm much more limited. I've never run into an issue when the laws. Everything's pretty clear. I mean, I've never been in a situation in the last 30 years where I've had a major conflict with anybody.
Yeah.
But people are attracted to these rivers because they're unique.
And I guess, you've said that you've definitely talked about kind of the benefits and the viewpoints of both sides. What are the benefits of having this kind of private ownership over streams and rivers? To the ecology, to the community itself, kind of
Sure.
on that side.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a great kind of segue into talking about valuation of ranches and specifically fly fishing properties. Again, the foundation of it begins with stream access. In Colorado, we are considered to have more private property rights when it comes to the control of riparian areas, which is essentially the area surrounding a stream or a river. And in Montana, those private property laws are still intact, but there's just a different way in which those streams are managed because they're wholly owned by the public, right? Including the stream bed. So there are pros and cons to each. For instance, in Colorado, you can own a completely private fishery, where from top to bottom, the only person that can access that fishery is the landowner or anyone, that's given permission by the landowner. So in some ways, those private property rights can translate into higher values. And on the flip, let's just use Montana again as another example. But the benefit in Montana, it's not all bad that that's a publicly owned resource. You could own a 60-acre piece of property along a river in Montana that has a remote access point into a river. And now you have the ability to get in the river and walk upstream and downstream off your property boundary into, whatever may be your neighbor, whether that's another private landowner or, some piece of national forest or publicly owned piece of property that the river's flowing through. But it gives you an access point to essentially an infinite amount of water.
Right.
So that's considered valuable as well. It just depends on kind of the profile and preferences of the buyer and, prospective landowner. So from kind of the valuation perspective, in Colorado, we see, and Ken, feel free to jump in here whenever you want, but I personally see a lot more stream valuation specific to the linear mile of stream that a ranch may own, right? When we start and look at a ranch, there are many things, many components of value that we break down, whether that's irrigated land, sub-irrigated land, dry upland land. Now, another one, if you have a fishing property, is going to be the river. How much river do you own? If you own a mile, is it one side or both sides? And that valuation can vary quite widely. You can have a small creek that might be $150,000 per mile. You might have, what I would call like the A grade fishery, which can be $1 million plus per mile for owning both sides. So that kind of approach to valuation, I don't see that as much in a state like Montana or other states that have more open public stream access, because it's not considered to be such a private asset to the ranch. It's not an owned component of value that we can then add into the overall valuation of the property.
Yeah, like in Montana, I assume you mainly is an attribute, right, to the land, so that the land that adjoins the river is assessed at a much higher value than, say, the land that's not.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think Montana too, and these other states, you see kind of that price per acre. That's just a higher price per acre. Hey, I'm on the Madison River in Southwest Montana. Okay, well, that's going to be just a higher price per acre because it's an attribute and adds character to the property. You can't necessarily say, hey, I own a mile of Madison River. Well, you own a mile of Madison River frontage, and that's a wonderful asset, and it makes your property more valuable, but we can't necessarily break that down into a value into of itself.
And it can even differ. Like, I know parts of the Colorado River are incredible fisheries, and we value those at a certain, price per mile. But you can go, near Kremling or something like that, where it's bigger. It's not as good of a fishery, but maybe have water rights. So that kind of affects value too, I'm sure.
Totally. Yeah.
Oh yeah. I had that one property out on the upper Colorado, and it was nice flows, but it was nowhere near the flows of the Blue Ribbon. The quality of the fishery was just much different. And to the general public, they may see it as a price per acre, but when we look at it and we break it down for our clients, we will throw in well, that has X miles or X feet of frontage. We'll look at different ways of valuating, and we will still look at a per acre valuation on the property, but we're going to look at it at least two different ways in that regard to come up with a number that we think is kind of the proper valuation. At least that's what we tend to do in-house on those particular type of segments on properties.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that practice has kind of come from some great appraisers, kind of deciding that that's how they might look at these fishing properties specifically, because they are purchased for that purpose. And so when appraisers are looking at that and trying to compile a database of comparable values, you say, okay, well, this property on the Yampa River sold for $1 million a mile last year, and the buyer agreed that that's kind of what he felt like it was worth. So let's now attribute that to this property that might be downstream 10 miles. So does that mean it's better or worse? What are the components down there? Do you have higher flow down there, lower flow? What's the character of the river down there? So then you can, make your adjustments upward and downward of that comparable or that average kind of price per mile. And it becomes just like anything else from a component of value perspective that we take a look at and can, bring into that overall blended price per acre and total price of the ranch.
And can you kind of speak a little bit more? You kind of hinted at it, but location on the river, like where the ranch is located and how that impacts value, especially in times like this where we're experiencing some low flows, some drought. How does location kind of impact that?
Yeah, that's another good segue into the conversation on drought resiliency and looking at these fly fishing properties specifically in this day and age and going forward, as we're in drought patterns and we're experiencing historic low flows on a lot of the watersheds throughout the West. There's that old adage about location, right? Always in real estate. And it proves true in fly fishing properties as well. There are certain things that we tend to look at when we're evaluating a fishing property, like how close are you to the source of the water, whether that be a tailwater, meaning a dam controlled, regulated flow river, or a freestone river, which is undammed and flowing directly from the mountains and and snow melt and runoff and natural spring water that may come out of the ground. How close are you to that source? Because the closer you are to the source, the more predictable your flows are going to be throughout the year. If you're way downstream on a river, you may be more susceptible to low flows, which are going to impact the quality of the fishery. And what that really means is, water temperature and water volume. So the lower water gets in the river, the warmer it gets, and the trout are. You might have, fish die off because the water becomes too warm and there's not enough oxygen in the water for the trout to breathe. So all these things are just kind of an understanding of what makes something valuable versus less valuable. And Ken and I were talking about this the other day too, about it's not necessarily how close you are to the source. While that's a consideration, you also want to consider other things that might impact the flow of a river, like irrigation diversions, right? So in the West, we have a lot of water rights that are diverted out of rivers into irrigation ditches to go and irrigate hay and supply water for crops and what have you. If you're right below a irrigation diversion that in the middle of summer is pulling out half of the water out of the stream, well, that's definitely something to consider when you're looking at owning that property, right? So all these things are important when you're looking at drought and flow and what we might be looking at long term, 10, 20 years from now, what's going to be the average flow of a river.
Yeah. And I know you guys have both had a lot of experience with fly fishing properties in general and dealing with water and drought and all those things. In your experience, have you worked on some ranches in the past or projects where they were able to mitigate some of this as it
Sure.
affects land value, water, all of that?
Yeah. So there's a couple of different main ways that I think that landowners can mitigate. And this again ties back into that valuation question. Like one thing that's always a question on a buyer's mind is how do I build value, right? I mean, I want to buy
Right.
this ranch and I want to make it better. I want to increase what it's worth, not only to me personally, but down the line when I might want to sell it, the asset's worth more than when I bought it. So how do I enhance that value? Well, stream restoration projects have become a major way in which landowners are doing that. And a stream restoration project is essentially a way in which you bring in a water engineer and you're actually changing how the flow of the stream is throughout the property. So you might be making more habitat, deeper holes, helping there to be more oxygen coming through the water. So you might build a shallow run where the water is more turbulent, getting more oxygenated, and then that run is dumping into a deeper pool. So now there's oxygenated water dumping into a deeper pool that in low flows creates habitat for fish to basically be in during the low flow event. And not only can they be there, but oxygenated water is coming into that piece of water. So it's become something, stream restoration's been around for a long time, but I think a lot more of it is happening this day and age in the last decade to try to mitigate against drought and to try to enhance value on ranches.
Yeah.
Just for the viewers out there too, when you're referring to this, you're not talking about like John Dutton when he exploded the river and diverted it to a different part. I just want people to be clear. That's not
that's
stream
not
restoration.
a thing, right?
Let's make that very
Good
clear.
Hollywood thing. Like Pass Creek Ranch, if up in Summit County, we have a listing up there where a lot of money and expertise was put into that stretch of the river. And I'll tell you, there are so many, hydrologists and consultants out there, who are fabulous at that, and they understand kind of the hydrology of the water and what the fish and the habitat needs, and they have to look at those flows. In that particular situation, I think we have, it's a bit of a controlled flow in the Blue River because you do have a dam above it, but still, when you get into low flows, you'd like to have those improvements made. And heck, that river goes all the way up, just below, we got Poulter Jones and some of his place down, but just above Kremling, where amazing habitat. I mean, some of these guys, I don't know what he paid, but there are some situations where they're paying like $1 million a mile or so. And this is private money, especially in Colorado. Now Daniel can speak to Montana. That's a little different structure, again, because it has to deal with the access laws, but they're paying a lot of money, and these private people, because they do have private rights. And so they are trying to enhance their private property by enhancing the value of the fishery.
Yeah. I think, all these topics kind of tie into one another, right? If you're improving the value of your stream, then you are improving that per linear mile valuation component of your ranch. And there are certainly different ways to do stream restoration. There's even another term out there called stream enhancement, which that's kind of creating things that might not exist otherwise in the stream naturally. As far as that's my opinion. I'm more of a stream restoration fan than I am a stream enhancement fan, trying to provide naturally occurring things that you might see naturally occurring in the river and in the ecosystem elsewhere. But Ken brings up a really good point as to how these restoration projects are done throughout the Intermountain West. Places like Wyoming and Colorado, you see a lot of this stream restoration being done with private dollars, right? The landowners are, for the most part, footing the bill to do this because they're improving the value of their property. There are programs out there where, organizations like Trout Unlimited might, contribute to a project that a landowner is taking under. But the reason for that is because they're improving the fishery overall outside of that landowner's boundaries. You're still providing habitat for fish that may move in and out of that area throughout the year. So you see a lot of, in those kind of privatized states, you see a lot of privately funded mitigation and restoration. In those states like Montana and Oregon, Idaho, you see a lot more of these projects, especially on the larger rivers. Let's say the Madison River, the Yellowstone River in Montana, the Weber River in Utah, the Snake River in Oregon. All of those rivers have had publicly funded restoration projects occur, and they're doing very similar things. They're trying to mitigate against low flow years and drought, but they're also trying to create more fish habitat, because in those states, the state commerce and economy revolves a lot around being able to, bring in tourism for fly fishing and whitewater rafting and so forth. So you see different kind of sources for this restoration to happen, but it is happening across the board throughout the West.
Well, it's interesting too. It's like kind of organizations and shared ranches like Elk Creek Ranch. They've kind of created this happy medium where it's still private ownership, but you have a way longer amount of river private access. A lot of that's restoration. What's the word that you prefer?
Restoration.
Restoration. But it's not public access, but it almost feels like it because you have less pressure from public fishermen, just like you might feel in Montana. But can you tell me a little bit more about kind of the benefits of shared ranches and why we're seeing a little bit more of that when it comes to fly fishing properties?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so a place like Elk Creek, which is a shared amenity ranch that we represent and have for the last 7 years. This is a place in Northwest Colorado, 100% private fishery, but they control upwards of 30 miles of streams. So that's the White River, Elk Creek, some other tributaries, some still water fishing in ponds and lakes, but it's 100% private. And it has the feel, because it's so expansive, of a place like Montana where you can walk forever, right? I mean, you have 30 miles of stream, and it feels like you're just kind of smack dab in the middle of it, and you have all of it at your disposal. It's the best of both worlds because you don't get any public fishing pressure, right? Like you can do that in Montana and walk up and down as much as you want, but you might see, another fly fisherman around the next bend. You might have boats floating by you, which, that's all wonderful as well. Again, there's pros and cons to both of these, but Elk Creek is kind of something that emerged out of this phenomenon in Colorado of privately held water. And, most fly fishing ranches in Colorado are smaller, right? They might own, and when I say smaller, I mean, they're not owning 30 miles of river, relatively smaller when compared to an Elk Creek. If someone was to buy a ranch in Colorado that controlled 30 miles of river, this would be a hundreds of millions of dollars likely ranch. Whereas a place like Elk Creek has developed a new model for ownership where multiple owners, right, can own this property and enjoy the recreation and stewardship of the property, and not have to deal with all of the pressures, right, public pressures that might go with that in a similar fishery in a different state.
Right.
So are there membership opportunities still available, Daniel?
Funny you should ask that, Ken. Yes. Anybody that's interested in this thing called Elk Creek Ranch, get in touch with me. We have a number of new listings coming on the market up there this spring. I'm actually headed up there after we get off this call.
Awesome.
Perfect.
And it's a spectacular spot, and it takes some discussion to fully understand it and comprehend the scope of it and how it operates. But we have some availability up there for anyone that's interested.
Well,
And for
I want to
those,
touch on too before,
yeah,
sorry, Haley,
no,
you
you're
know,
good.
restoration in of itself. And some people say, well, isn't Mother Nature good enough? And yes, Mother Nature is great. But over the years, just look at the West, and there's plenty of books that talk about from irrigation projects to dams to all these things that do impact rivers and fisheries. That restoration is a good thing for many things and sometimes necessary. And the contribution of private individuals, you said public, and I believe even some of our clients in the past. I think Dan, you worked on a project in Colorado where they were trying to protect some in-stream flows and other things through their efforts. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, thanks for reminding me about that one. Yeah, in addition to, just hardcore stream restoration, where we're actually, changing some hydrology of a river that might be helpful to habitat and low flow, there are, other mechanisms that we're seeing come up in kind of this more modern day of managing and looking at Western property. And the case that Ken is referencing is a property that we help to sell for a nonprofit organization called Western Rivers Conservancy. And I helped them to market this property after they had done this kind of special pilot project where, the water rights, this property was located in Southwest Colorado on the Little Cimarron River. And this gets into kind of a whole nother ball of wax, but we talk about over appropriation of water, right? Meaning we're now in drought, and everyone's got all these irrigation water rights coming out of the stream, and wow, in a drought year, there's just not enough water to go around. And
Right.
what happens then is the stream gets really low, and we've been talking about this throughout this whole call, but what Western Rivers Conservancy did was kind of this cutting edge concept of, what we don't want to do is what we call buy and dry, which is taking a property that has a lot of water rights and just drying it up to keep the water in stream, because then we're impacting the whole, agricultural ecosystem. We're no longer growing hay. We're affecting the viability and agricultural values of the ranch. So what WRC, Western Rivers, did was they developed a tool whereby they would look at what the forecasted flows were going to be for that year. And if we were going to be in a drought year, they would have a calculation to say, we're going to need X amount of water to stay in stream. And in some years, it would be most of the water rights that the ranch owned would stay in stream to support fish habitat. In years where we had normal to high flow, we weren't going to be as impacted, and that water would be used to irrigate like it historically has been. But this was a legal instrument that they did, and there is essentially a deed restriction on this property that dictates in perpetuity how the water will be utilized on the ranch. And it's one kind of different way of thinking about how we might mitigate against drought.
Another tool in the toolbox, and also kudos to Colorado Water Trust for really helping shape that too and work in it, because we do a lot of conservation work within the group, and we work with a lot of these entities around the West. And I mean, again, another, like conservation easement, another thing, another tool in the toolbox.
Yeah, for landowners to use at their disposal. And did you see that kind of as a successful working on it? Did you feel like that could like a pilot program that a lot of other landowners could possibly use in the future?
Yeah, I think it's not for everyone, right?
Right.
And that tool might not work for the next landowner or for that, property and where it's located. But I think it can be something that that landowners can use, and the property successfully sold. So it didn't completely diminish the value, right, of the ranch. It was still considered a valuable agricultural property, which is really what it was. It had significant water right on this stream to be able to irrigate. And the buyer looked at it and said, I think I can live with this. And they had a little bit more progressive mindset that said, you know what, I think this is a good thing. We don't need all that water all summer long. Let's keep some of it in stream, because the part of the valuation of the ranch, was the ag, but it's also the fishery, right? So
Right.
we're coming up with a balance. And yeah, I think it's really interesting to see how, organizations and individuals are coming up with new ways in which to manage and mitigate against these issues. I mean, Ken had one a couple summers ago where they were leasing water rights downstream.
Yeah, on the Cottonwood, part of the Green River, tributary to Colorado. But this is where you start getting into that nexus of water rights
Mhm.
And fishing.
and then fishery, right? Because
Mhm.
so much of the water right laws are driven towards the irrigation rights, and those rights are they superior to the fishery component and the wildlife? So there is this connection that people need to understand when they look at this, and again, it's not rocket science, but it is. Some of the variables are changing, so understanding how those variables affect you and your land, your landscape, and your fishery, and your wildlife, and your irrigation, all those things just come into play. And that's kind of what we're here to do, kind of help people understand that.
Yep. And we did have a few questions just before I let you guys go, because I know you got to fly up to Meeker. But we did have one question that came in, and I think we kind of hinted on it while we were talking, but is it legal for a rancher or property owner to put a fence across a river, blocking boats from floating? That was one of the questions we got.
Did they clarify what state they were wondering about?
Colorado, actually.
Okay.
They did.
It depends. Like many of these answers will probably be it depends. So we talk about navigability, right, in Colorado. That's kind of how we delineate some public water and being able to float it. And even that term navigability has different interpretations. But for trying to provide a good answer to this question, if the stream is navigable, then no, a landowner cannot block float traffic from coming through. That would be illegal. If the stream is not navigable, or it's kind of questionable, that's where we would get into this, where I've seen this before, when a river is questionably navigable. I would say if at any time in Colorado, if your raft or your boat is going to rub on the bottom of the river, I would not say that river is navigable by Colorado state law. But if you can make it through that property without incidentally touching the bottom of the river or the side of the river, then no, then if you come up to a blockade and there's a fence or razor wire across the river, the landowner shouldn't be doing that.
Yeah, there's could and should,
Yeah.
and then there's and then there's legal elements, and we're not going to sit there and project legal positions in this situation. I mean, in the end, there's laws of the West and there's a code of the West. In any of this, like I said, you could do a lot of things, but should you? Probably not, right? It's that very issue sometimes that people do that causes that. Like I think in the last 5 years, somebody tried to do that up near Crested Butte and put a low hanging bridge or something to impede somebody's use of the river. That then fostered some stream access users to say, look, we need to change the law in Colorado. So, if you want to contest those things as a private individual, be careful with what you're trying to accomplish, because you might have the exact, opposite result. And I hate to say this, I have to, because I was a Russian studies major. It's like Putin saying, hey, we're going to stop NATO, but with Ukraine, and look, now Finland and Sweden want to do it. So you join NATO. I mean, you don't do certain things. So look at the code of the West in the end, right?
Classic Russia.
Yeah, it's a nice plug.
Didn't you like that analogy? Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, I mean, so this article, and there may be other questions, but I just wanted to say that
No,
I
you're good.
wrote up this article in the last few days that I tried to just make kind of cut and dry. Here's the stream access as you should interpret it in different states, but there's always something going on, right? This is a hot topic across the West, and in Colorado, we've had a recent court case that the Attorney General has now, recommended the Supreme Court hear this case. That's all about a private fly fisherman waiting on, a public fly fisherman waiting on private ground. And so there are nuances to this, and the interpretation of the law, right, it can be different. And I'm not a lawyer, so I can't do that. But I think it's just important to understand both sides of the story. I think as advocates for landowners, we are also advocates for ecosystems and natural resources. So those things go hand in hand. And I think it's important, as people take different positions, it's important, for public fly fishermen to realize that private lands are providing a lot of habitat for not only fish, but for elk and all kinds of different wildlife, right? And the public gets to enjoy some of that as well. And it goes the other way, right? It goes to the private landowner that, there are things that the public are doing that are benefiting them as landowners. Let's take that, Montana stream restoration. There's public dollars that are being spent to restore these streams that are improving the values of private landowners' properties. So it goes both ways. I think it's just important that people remember that.
Well, and Haley, there's just a lot of different case law right now, even
Right.
With corner crossings on fences and access to public lands through private, there's always that, again, a little conflict between recreational expectations and rights of recreational users of property and public lands and private individuals. It's just the nature of kind of our country and how we were created with public lands and all these things. And these issues will never go away. Again, just going into being good landowners, being good public, recreational users. If everybody kind of does the right thing, there's no problems. It's just when people kind of push the envelope sometimes, this is what happens.
And with all these nuances, it's really good to have a partner like Daniel to walk you through the process and get to know these kind of fly fishing properties around the West. And I'll let you kind of finish what you were going to say before we.
Well, I think, I know we kind of need to try to wrap up a little bit. And if there's other questions from viewers, happy to take them. But, I think one thing I wanted to cover a little bit that folks may be looking for is a bit of, the market update, right? We've talked a lot about what impacts value on fly fishing ranches throughout the West, but where are we at as far as, what's the market right now?
Right.
And the market is strong, right, across the board. The ranch market is maybe as strong as it's ever been, and Ken can speak to that, like longevity piece of, real estate is always cyclical, but we are seeing some unprecedented demand in the market right now. And again, this connects to everything we've been talking about. I think the influx of population throughout the Intermountain West is at an all-time high. We're seeing population rise in all different areas of the West. And, as that occurs, we're seeing more pressure on public lands and public resources and more demand for access to what may be deemed private resources. So, that ties into what the market's doing. In my opinion, fly fishing properties have always been the most scarce type of ranch out there. And I think the valuation of them goes along with that. And that's no different right now. There is certainly scarcity in the market for quality fly fishing ranches. Not to say that they are not available. There are certainly ranches out there One thing that I think is important too in this conversation of where the market is, I think there is a lot of opportunity right now to create value on fisheries. What may be viewed as, the quote unquote B grade fishery. Okay, well, I think there are now opportunities to create that value and move that from a B to a B plus or an A minus fishery. And, to kind of see the forest through the trees on that, I think there's a lot of opportunity in the market right now to find those types of properties where value can be built. And, there's always, it may take some patience to find the right one, but that's why you use someone like us that has their finger on the pulse of the market and can be opportunistic when those opportunities come up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's a lot of it too that we've been handling is off market stuff. So it really does require kind of your knowledge of streams and rivers and communities and fishing and where to look. So we really appreciate you taking the time to go through all of this. And again, for those who are watching, Daniel did recently write a blog that we'll be sending out later this week. If you want to get it first before anyone else, reach out to us personally on our website. But I'll let you get on your plane and get up to Mirr because I know you got some new photos and new listings to take. But thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. It's been fun, and we'll do it again.
Awesome. Thanks, Ken.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
See ya.
See ya. And for those who are still watching, as always, you can subscribe to our newsletter on www.mirranchgroup.com. And as a subscriber of that newsletter, you'll get access to things like the blog that Daniel wrote. If you have any other questions about fly fishing properties, please don't hesitate to reach out. We can be reached at 303-623-4545. Thanks a lot, guys. See you in 2 weeks.